He thought he had it all figured out, until he realized he was just a pawn in their twisted game. Betrayed by those he trusted the most, Kiann faces a ruthless plot that goes deeper than he could ever imagine. With one final move, he holds the power to flip everything on its head. But in this game, no one plays fair. Will he take revenge or become another victim? That evening, Kiann came home earlier than usual. The workday had drained him to the core, and all he wanted was a cold beer and a few hours of silence. But as soon as he stepped through the door, he felt something strange. The house was too quiet, too empty. His mind quickly came up with several logical explanations. Gwen might have gone to the store, might have fallen asleep, or simply didn't hear him come in. But something about the silence made his heart beat faster. He slowly moved forward, trying to figure out what exactly was making him uneasy. There was no smell of dinner coming from the kitchen, strange, since Gwen always cooked something. The table had no traces of her presence. He shrugged off his jacket, walked to the refrigerator, but didn't even open it. His mind was racing with one question. Where was she? When Kiann climbed to the second floor, he heard the sound of water running in the bathroom. Gwen was home. So what was wrong? His gaze involuntarily landed on the phone lying on the dresser. The screen was lit up. A new message had come in. She had always been cautious, never leaving her phone unattended. He didn't want to be the kind of man who rummaged through his wife's things, didn't want to find what could destroy his life. But something stronger than him made him lean over and look at the screen. I can still taste you. When will we see each other again? The blood in his veins froze. Kiann reread the message, hoping he had imagined it. But no, every word was real. His breathing became shallow. It took him a moment to realize he was gripping the phone so tightly that his fingers were turning white. The bathroom. The water was still running. He took a step towards the door, then another. His pulse thumped in his ears, his thoughts scattered. Who was this? How long had it been going on? Was she really? Kiann stopped before the door and took a deep breath. He needed to calm down. He needed to think coldly. Should he make a scene right now? Burst through the door? Charge in? And scream? But what would that change? He knew nothing. Not yet. He turned around and walked to the living room. He sat on the couch, staring at the phone still in his hand. Who was the sender? Just a number. He could write it down, trace it, find out who it belonged to. Instead, he pressed the lock button and placed the phone back on the dresser. He heard the water stop running. His heart was pounding in his chest. The bathroom door opened, and Gwen, wrapped in a towel, walked out, drying her wet hair. She looked surprised when she saw Kiann. Already home? I thought you'd be back later. He forced himself to smile. Finished work early. Decided to come home. She walked past him, completely unaware that something was wrong. He watched as she opened the wardrobe, glanced over her clothes, moved, casual, without a hint of fear. Either she was an incredible actress, or what? He said nothing. That evening, he acted as usual. He joked at dinner, listened to her stories about her day, kissed her goodnight. But something inside him had changed. He lay in bed, listening to her steady breathing, staring at the ceiling. Thoughts passed through his mind one by one. Had she been lying all this time? Was their entire life a lie? He spent the night awake. And in the morning, when Gwen came out of the shower and went to make coffee, Kiann took her phone. There was no password. He went into the messages. And what he saw made his stomach tighten with disgust. This was not a one-time affair. It had been going on for months. Chats full of lies, hundreds of messages with hints, promises, and secret arrangements. She had written that she missed him, that she wanted him, that Kiann had no idea. His hands were shaking. In that moment, he realized two things. The first, his marriage was over. The second, Gwen had no idea he knew. He put the phone back, lay back in bed, and closed his eyes. Took a deep breath. Then, he smiled. It wasn't just betrayal. It was the beginning of the end. Kiann lay in bed, listening to Gwen preparing breakfast in the kitchen. Everything seemed normal. She hummed a melody as she moved plates and cups around. But Kiann already knew the truth. And that fact burned him from the inside. He could snap right now, burst into the kitchen, throw her phone in her face, and demand an explanation. But why? He had read her messages. He knew it wasn't a one-time mistake. She had been cheating on him for months. She had planned everything down to the smallest detail, writing to her lover when Kiann was around, sharing how smoothly everything was going, how he suspected nothing. His wife had been laughing behind his back. That thought cut deeper than a knife to the back. He got up as if nothing had happened, went downstairs, greeted her, and sat at the table. Gwen placed a cup of coffee in front of him, sat next to him, and leaned slightly forward. She was wearing a thin chain with a pendant he hadn't seen before. A small heart, surrounded by stones. Nice pendant. New. She flinched but quickly regained composure. Oh, yeah, I bought it a few days ago. Pretty, huh? Kiann smiled. Very. She had no idea that he knew. She sat next to him, talking to him as usual, deceiving him as easily as she breathed. And that made Kiann calm. Before, rage would take over, and he'd feel a storm inside him. But now everything had changed. His anger had become cold, precise. He had a plan. That same day, he started acting. The first step, gathering information. He grabbed her phone when she went to the shower, wrote down her lover's number. He looked at the name in the contacts. Just R. No photo. A pseudonym? The first letter of a name? Kiann didn't know, but it didn't matter. He would trace that number and find out who it belonged to. The next step was surveillance. He paid attention to every detail. What underwear she wore on regular days and what she wore when staying late at work. How she changed her perfume when she came home later than usual. She thought she was being careful. She thought he was still her blind, trusting husband. And that was her biggest mistake. That evening, when they lay in bed, Gwen pressed herself to him, resting her head on his chest. How was your day? Kiann stroked her back. As usual. And yours? He felt her tense for a second before she answered. Oh, just a bunch of work. The boss was in a terrible mood. Good thing tomorrow's Friday. Yeah, Friday. He repeated, staring at the ceiling. He knew she was planning to spend the Friday not with him. The next day, Kiann stayed home to work remotely while Gwen went to work as usual. But now he was paying attention to every detail. At 7 p.m., she was supposed to work for another hour, but she sent a message saying she'd be staying until 10. Kiann got in his car and drove to her office. When he parked nearby, he saw her leave. But not alone. A man in a dark coat, tall and fit, opened the car door for her. Gwen looked around, her eyes sparkling with excitement. Then she got in, and they drove off. Kiann pressed into the seat, gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles cracked. He knew he shouldn't follow them. That he should wait, gather more evidence, come up with the perfect plan. But right now, in this moment, only one thought consumed him. He had to know. He had to see it with his own eyes. He followed them, keeping his distance. His heart pounded in his chest, his throat was dry. When they parked near a hotel, he almost laughed at the irony. It was so cliché. So predictable. Gwen got out first, then her R. They walked inside, and Kiann stayed in the car, watching them. He could have burst in right now, stormed into the hotel, made a scene, and forced her to see his rage. But no. It was too simple. He pressed the record button on his phone and took a few pictures. Then he got out of the car, shoved his hands in his pockets, and walked toward the hotel. His heart was calm, steady. He didn't know exactly what he was going to do. But he knew one thing. Tonight, everything would change. Kiann walked toward the hotel entrance, feeling his body tense to the limit. Each step echoed in his mind like the strikes of a hammer. Inside, his anger boiled, but he kept it under control. He couldn't let his emotions take over. He had to remain cold, calculated, like a predator stalking its prey. Stopping by the entrance, he sighed and took a deep breath. He didn't need to hurry. They were inside. They felt safe. They thought their little secret was protected by the walls of this hotel. But they didn't know that Kiann was already near. He opened the door and stepped inside. The lobby was quiet, except for the soft hum of conversations at the reception desk. He walked down the carpeted aisle, casting a quick glance at the elevators. One of them had just stopped on the 4th floor. The 4th floor. Kiann approached the reception desk. His heart beat evenly, coldly. He forced a smile. Excuse me, I have a surprise for my wife. We often stay here, and I know she booked a room today. Can you tell me which one she's staying in? The receptionist, a young man in uniform, looked awkward. Sorry, but we can't disclose that information. Kiann pretended to be disappointed but didn't back down. I understand. It's just, I bought her a gift and wanted to make a nice surprise. Nothing bad. The boy hesitated but then quickly checked something on the monitor. Your wife. What's her name? Kiann knew he couldn't give her real name. Jessica. The receptionist browsed through the booking list. We have a Jessica on the 4th floor, room 412. Kiann smiled. Oh, great. Thank you. He stepped away from the desk, feeling triumph spreading through his body. Room 412. He entered the elevator and pressed the button for the 4th floor. The doors closed, and Kiann closed his eyes for a few seconds. He needed to be careful. He couldn't just barge into the room and create a scene. No, he had to observe. He had to know exactly what she was doing behind his back. The elevator stopped smoothly, and the doors slid open. The hallway was dim, lit only by subdued lamps. Kiann walked slowly forward, counting the doors. For 08. For 10. For 112. He stopped. Inside, muffled sounds could be heard. Voices. Laughter. His fingers clenched into a fist. He wanted to bang on the door, break it open, and look her in the eye. But he didn't. He took out his phone, opened the camera, and started recording. He needed evidence. He had to capture everything. The door wasn't fully closed. He pushed it open a few millimeters and saw something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Gwen in his arms, kissing him, touching him the way she once touched Kiann. The man, tall, dark-haired. Kiann didn't recognize him, but it didn't matter. The blood in his veins froze. He filmed. Gwen laughed, then said something he couldn't hear. The man leaned in, whispered something in her ear, and she smiled. She was happy. She didn't feel an ounce of guilt. She didn't care. Kiann couldn't watch any longer. He turned and walked back down the hallway slowly, without a sound. He didn't remember how he got to the car. He just sat and stared at the dark windshield. He replayed that moment in his head over and over again. Her laugh. Her touch. Her betrayal. He had to do something. He wouldn't let her get away with it. Kiann unlocked his phone, opened the photos he'd taken, and sent them to his laptop. This was just the beginning. Gwen didn't know yet that her world was about to collapse. And when it did, Kiann would make sure she felt every shard of that destruction. Kiann sat in the car, gripping his phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. He kept watching the video he had just taken. Gwen and that man. Her laugh. Her touch. Her betrayal. Everything mixed in his head. Despair, rage, resentment. Every detail of their moment together seared into his memory so deeply that he knew he couldn't forget it, even if he wanted to. He leaned back in his seat, took a deep breath, and tried to collect his thoughts. He was torn between the urge to act right now. He could get up there, kick down the door, catch her off guard, force her to confess, crush her lies right in front of her lover. But then what? Would she deny it? Cry? Apologize? Or, on the contrary, stand her ground and claim that it's none of his business? No, it was too simplistic. What he needed was not just an emotional scene. He needed revenge. He slowly pressed his lips together into a barely noticeable smile. His heart was still pounding, but not from panic. From anticipation. She had destroyed his life. Now it was her turn. He got home around 2 in the morning. The streets were empty, only a few streetlights flickered here and there. His body was exhausted, but his mind was working at full capacity. He already knew what to do. As soon as he entered the apartment, he smelled the familiar scent of her perfume. She was here. Home. Sleeping in their bed, as if nothing had happened. Kiann stopped at the bedroom door and silently looked at her. Gwen was lying on her side, her long hair spread out on the pillow. Her face was calm, even happy. Was she dreaming something nice? Perhaps of the man she had just spent the night with? Kiann took a deeper breath, holding back the desire to wake her up right now. No, he wouldn't let emotions control him. Instead, he quietly walked to the kitchen, took a bottle of water from the fridge, and sat down at the table. His laptop was exactly where he had left it in the morning. He turned it on, inserted the flash drive, and transferred the video and photos he had taken at the hotel. He opened Gwen's social media. Her page looked perfect. A happy married life, photos together, romantic dinners. She even posted a picture of them kissing just a week ago. The cynicism. Kiann felt a wave of anger rise within him, but he suppressed it. Tomorrow, he would start destroying this fake world, brick by brick. The next morning, Kiann woke up earlier than usual. Gwen was still asleep. He went to the shower, washing off the remnants of the previous night. The water ran hot, but inside, he was cold. When he came out, she was already in the kitchen. "Oh, you're up already?" Gwen smiled, pouring herself some coffee. She was wearing his old t-shirt, her hair slightly messy, her face fresh. She looked happy. Kiann gave her the same smile, though in his mind, he could already see her illusion of happiness crumbling to dust. "Yes, I have a lot to do." Gwen walked up to him, ran her fingers over his chest, and kissed him lightly on the lips. Kiann barely held back the urge to pull away. "Where did you disappear last night?" she asked, studying him with her gaze. "I just drove around, cleared my head, he answered calmly. She nodded and took another sip of her coffee. He knew she didn't even suspect that he had been there, that he had seen everything, that he knew. After breakfast, Gwen went to work and Kiann stayed home. He logged into a work call, worked for a few hours, but all his thoughts were on one thing. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, he picked up his phone and opened the messages. He dialed the number R. A long ring. 1, 2. And then, short beep, call answered. Hello. The man's voice was deep, confident, even a bit smug. Kiann paused for a second. He imagined that man running his fingers through her hair, whispering something to her, touching her in ways only he should have. He clenched his fist, but his voice remained cold. Who are you? A few seconds of silence. Sorry, who's speaking? Gwen's husband. The silence on the other end was long, almost eternal. Kiann could barely hear the man's heavy breathing, but he could imagine how he felt, watching his plan crumble. Listen, the man finally said, but Kiann interrupted him. I know everything. I have video. I have photos. And now I have you. A deep breath from the other end. Let's talk. We'll talk. Very soon. Kiann pressed end call and leaned back in his chair. He felt the fire starting to burn inside him. This was just the first thread he had pulled. Gwen and her lover had no idea they were already standing on the edge of a cliff. And now Kiann was deciding when exactly to push them into the abyss. Kiann sat in silence for a long time, staring at his laptop screen. The photos and videos he had taken were already saved. They clearly showed the betrayal, everything he needed. But he knew that wasn't enough. These pieces of evidence had to be used at the right moment, when his enemies were most vulnerable. He stood up from the table, lifting his head to feel the air in the room grow thicker. Another thought crossed his mind. Was he ready for this? The desire for revenge was strong, but would it be true retribution or just a fleeting emotional reaction? Kiann tried not to let himself get swept up in feelings, even though he wanted to tear apart the deceitful world that had built up around him. The next morning, he woke up a few hours earlier than usual. Gwen was still asleep, her slow, peaceful breathing barely reaching his ears. She looked so carefree, as if nothing had happened. But he knew that this was just a temporary illusion. She had no idea that he already knew everything. Kiann got dressed, gathered his things, and headed for the garage. He needed to make a few calls, establish the necessary contacts to unleash the full force of what he had in his hands. Every step had to be precise, thought out to the smallest detail. And this moment was only the beginning of the big game. As soon as he left the house, Gwen remained behind, still calm and carefree, unaware that her time was running out. He got into his car and drove in an unknown direction, concealing every step he took. At the nearest cafe, he met with an old colleague. The man had influence in certain circles, and Kiann knew that he would be useful. They discussed plans, and Kiann handed him a few photos. He smiled. Are you sure you know what you're doing? The colleague asked, reviewing the pictures. I know what I'm doing, Kiann replied, focusing on the table. But I need help. He set off for another city, where several important meetings were waiting. While Kiann decided how to proceed next, Gwen had her own routine. She had her meetings, her affairs. She was too busy to think about what was happening with her husband. That evening, Kiann returned home, feeling the fire of revenge burning in his chest. He knew it wasn't time to reveal everything yet, but there were still a few things to do. He needed to make sure Gwen would be completely consumed by her own illusions. He waited for her to come home, and when he heard footsteps on the stairs, Kiann was already standing in the dark hallway. The keys clicked in the lock again. The door opened, and Gwen entered the apartment. Hi, she said, taking off her coat. She looked as though nothing had happened. How was your day? Kiann kept calm on his face, but inside, he was on the edge. He approached her and embraced her, trying to hide the storm inside. Everything's fine, he replied, touching her hair. How was yours? She didn't notice anything suspicious in his behavior. Kiann felt his heart breaking from this lie, but he decided not to act hastily. Later that evening, after they ate, Gwen invited Kiann to watch TV. He silently agreed, not telling her about his business, and sat next to her, watching her usual movements. As always, she was so carefree, so far from what was happening behind her back. In his mind, a plan was already forming. Kiann knew that the next step would be to send urgent messages. He had discussed this with people he trusted. Now it was just a matter of waiting for the moment to be right. Keanu took out his phone and dialed the number 4R. Another long ring. And again, a deep breath. When the man picked up, Keanu already knew that now was his time. The moment when everything he had built up would finally come to its logical conclusion. "You still don't understand why I'm calling," Keanu said calmly, but his voice carried an undeniable pressure. The man on the other end responded, but Keanu didn't listen. He was already immersed in the feeling of it. The feeling of the moment when everything would begin to crumble, when every detail would become part of this massive reckoning. This is just the beginning, Keanu thought, pressing the button to end the call. Keanu sat on the edge of the bed, holding the phone in his hands. His fingers trembled, though he tried to remain calm. Everything was in its place, and a few more important calls would change everything. He made the final move, calling the number he knew best. However, this time his voice sounded different. Calm, steady, with the feeling that now everything would turn in his favor. "Hi, it's Keanu," he said, looking at the black screen of the phone. On the other end, there was only a few seconds of silence. So he had to repeat himself. "Hi, it's Keanu. We have business." "What happened?" The voice on the line was dry, professional. And Keanu immediately understood. Everything was going according to plan. But he had a new goal, the real plan, which would completely change the course of this conflict. "I'm one step ahead now. And I have one special document. All the documents, photos, and videos, they're just a part." "I know more," Keanu replied, feeling his heart beating faster. Not surprised, the voice on the line understood everything. "Are you ready for this?" Keanu let out a breath and lowered his head. He had long since stopped being just a man deceived by his wife. Now, he was the one controlling the game, and this moment was just the prologue. Meanwhile, Gwen prepared dinner, as always, with attractive details. She was in her element, ready to surprise and win over Keanu with her devotion. He didn't see it. In reality, he had long been far removed from what was happening in their relationship. Keanu headed for another important meeting, where his next steps would be determined. The meeting took place in a small office of one of the lawyers Keanu had recently met through his business dealings. Keanu wasn't sure how loyal this lawyer was to him, but for now, the circumstances were such that he could use him for his own purposes. "All this evidence is great," the lawyer said, reviewing the materials Keanu had gathered. "But there's one small detail that could change everything." Keanu looked at him, surprised. "What exactly?" The lawyer smiled and placed a folder on the table. Keanu opened it and saw unfamiliar documents, more photos, videos, showing a completely different person. Keanu felt shock wash over him. He couldn't believe his eyes. "Who is this?" His voice became cold as ice. "Here's where it gets interesting," the lawyer replied, pushing the stack of papers forward. "These are your worst fears. You thought you knew who your wife really was? This is her other story. And not with just anyone, but with your best friend." Keanu fell silent. He couldn't believe this was happening. His best friend, who was supposed to be his support, had actually become part of the betrayal. Another blow to his pride, another void to be filled with the truth. "I knew it all along," Keanu said, standing up. "How do you want to use this?" The lawyer, without lifting his gaze from the table, answered. "Will you go to him with this information, or leave it as it is? This could be your most powerful trump card. The choice is yours." Keanu decided not to make hasty decisions. But his choice wasn't as simple as he first thought. Evidence of betrayal, the betrayal of a friend, and now a new twist, another possible path. What would happen if he chose revenge? "What do you suggest?" he asked, sitting down again. "Well, there's one scenario," the lawyer said, lighting a cigarette. "But you have to be ready for it. It won't just be a defeat for your wife and friend. It will be total destruction. Are you ready for that?" Keanu didn't answer immediately. He was trying to process everything that was happening. A new idea emerged in his mind, another love angle. An angle he didn't believe in, but one that could give him the answers he needed. A few days later, Keanu unexpectedly met a woman he had once loved, but, for certain reasons, their relationship had not worked out. It was his old acquaintance, Alice. She was a professional psychologist, and it was she whom Keanu unexpectedly brought into his plan. She was smart, beautiful, and perhaps she could help him navigate everything that was happening now. Alice learned everything that had happened in Keanu's life, and when he told her, her reaction wasn't what he expected. "You want revenge," she said, looking him in the eyes. "But you don't even consider that you might be a bigger manipulator than they are. It's not just like that. This is your choice." Keanu was moved by her words, but still decided that this time, he was playing his game, and it would be final. He stood before Gwen's door, holding a letter that could change everything. The choice was made. Kiann stood on the doorstep, in front of the door that had once felt familiar. His hand trembled as he squeezed the paper in his hand. A letter that could put an end to everything, or perhaps just be the beginning of an even bigger game. Today everything was supposed to change. He had gathered everything he had. Information, evidence, secret negotiations. But now he was on the edge, as this meeting with Gwen, which he had been putting off for so long, was going to be decisive. Could what had been lost be returned, or was the only option to destroy everything? He still didn't know what step he would take next. Kiann reached for the door handle, but didn't get the chance to touch it. Suddenly, he heard a soft sound, the familiar ringtone on his phone. He pulled it from his pocket and looked at the screen. The number. Unknown. He wasn't doubting it. It was the same lawyer he had been working with. It seemed there was another twist today, and Kiann already had a feeling that this was no ordinary call. "Hello?" he said, pressing the accept call button. "Kiann, it's me. Are you ready for what we discussed?" The voice was calm, even a bit cold. "What happened?" Kiann asked, although he already had an idea forming in his mind. "I have another piece of evidence. You're not the only one with information. Remember who your wife is. She's still playing her game, but now you have another card in your hand," the lawyer replied. "You'll be able to make her yield." Kiann felt his heart leap. He knew that not everything he had gathered was entirely safe yet, and this new piece of evidence could be decisive. However, there was one question. Why was the lawyer telling him this now? Hadn't the game ended yet? Was there some new move? "I'll do whatever it takes, but what about other options?" Kiann tried not to show his surprise, although his mind was already working at full speed. "Think about it. All your games, all your trump cards, they're just a part. You chose, but now." The voice on the other end faded, and Kiann felt the tension starting to close in from all sides. "You've only just begun." Suddenly, Kiann began to feel that something wasn't right. Why was the lawyer speaking like this? What wasn't in his plans? And was there something he still didn't know? This meant one thing. The intrigue was just beginning. He hung up and looked at Gwen's door. The feeling that something important was hidden from him grew. However, he was no longer the man he had been a few months ago, and he was ready to face her. Opening the door, he entered and saw her sitting on the couch as if nothing had happened. Only her gaze, which seemed calm but deeply held a secret. She looked at him but didn't smile. Gwen didn't look guilty. She was as calm as always, even with all the evidence in hand. "Kiann," she said, her voice unwavering. "You've come." Kiann felt something change. She wasn't flustered. She didn't look like he expected. It was as if everything was under her control. "What do you want from me?" she asked, standing up. Her eyes held a ruthless confidence, the kind not usually seen in someone caught in a lie. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he placed the papers with photographs and videos on the table. Evidence, but not the kind he had hoped for. "I know everything," he said quietly, his voice cold with certainty, not anger. "And you don't have any more chances. Now I decide." But Gwen wasn't surprised. She just looked at him, and something in her gaze shifted. She became more enigmatic, but not panicked. It was too unusual. "Do you really think this scares me?" she said, and her voice had no fear. "Kiann, you still haven't realized that this game has just started, and I'm not alone in it." He couldn't believe his ears. She said it so calmly that Kiann began to doubt whether he understood everything correctly. Gwen wasn't actually who he thought she was. Suddenly, he heard footsteps from the hallway, and his gaze immediately turned to the door. She wasn't alone. And then, another man appeared. It was the same friend Kiann had once worked with. His business partner. The very one with whom he had shared his deepest secrets. "Decided to complicate things again, Kiann?" He smiled, entering the room. "Still trying to control everything around?" At that moment, Kiann realized that the situation had slipped out of his control. What he had considered his best trump cards had now become part of an even bigger game. Gwen, her lover, the lawyer, they were all pieces of a complex and cunning plan designed to destroy him. And this was just the beginning. He took a step back, but didn't give up. Now, Kiann had a real card in his hand, a card that could change everything. Kiann stood before Gwen and her former partner, Trevor, and felt the ground beneath him beginning to crumble. What he had just learned completely changed the picture of what was happening. And this new reality was far from what he could have imagined. "Did you really think it was all that simple?" Trevor said, stepping towards him. His voice was calm, even slightly dismissive, but there was ruthless determination in his eyes. Kiann didn't respond. His mind was working at high speed, trying to make sense of all these new facts. Trevor, his former business partner, the person with whom Kiann had once shared not only work moments but personal moments of life. And now he stood before him as part of a great intrigue that Kiann didn't fully understand yet. Really didn't get it? When asked, her voice now even colder and more piercing. She stood to the side, watching him with an expression as if everything that had happened was just part of her plan. Trevor and we've been working together for a long time. And this is not just about you, Kiann. It's about what's really behind everything we do. Kiann clenched his fist but didn't allow himself to lose control. He needed to understand what was going on, or he might lose everything. His gaze was firm, but inside, his heart raced faster than he could allow himself. What are you planning? His voice sounded hoarse, but he tried not to show his anxiety. There was more question than statement in it. Trevor approached the table where the papers and videos lay and lightly unfolded them. He didn't speak immediately. His gaze slid carefully over the documents. This isn't just about your wife, Kiann, he said, lifting one of the papers. It was always about more. It's about money, and about how we could use your position for something much bigger. Kiann flinched. He couldn't believe that Trevor, the person he had worked with for so many years, had become part of this ruthless plan. But what shocked him even more was Gwen, standing next to him, her face expressionless, unable to show any guilt. This meant one thing. Everything had been a manipulation from the very start. Did you think everything we did was just small games with serious consequences? When asked, approaching him, her gaze cold and piercing. I didn't choose you to love you, Kiann. I chose you because you were a useful tool. Kiann understood that he couldn't trust either of these two people. And everything that had happened between them was just part of a bigger game he could never have predicted. But that's not all, Gwen continued, her voice growing quieter. Trevor and we've both been planning to use you. And all of this was part of one big project you haven't seen the end of yet. Kiann carefully lifted his head, and a fire of determination sparked in his eyes. He was no longer willing to sit and listen to their mockery. Now, he had more than just doubts. He had a plan. I'm starting to understand, he said quietly, but his voice sounded confident. Everything you did was just the beginning. And you thought I wouldn't figure it out? Trevor and Gwen exchanged glances but didn't respond to his words. They continued to watch him with curiosity, as if checking whether he was ready to make his move. Kiann fell silent for a moment, but everything began to fall into place in his mind. What they had shown him, and what he had learned from the lawyer, was just the beginning. He had one more card hidden up his sleeve. And now, it was time to play it. He stepped back and suddenly pulled another document from his pocket, the contract he had once signed with Trevor. And now, this contract had become his final trump card. You have a plan, Kiann said, his voice sounding more threatening, but you forgot one important detail. I have my own tools. Gwen and Trevor fell silent. Anxiety appeared in their eyes. Kiann took another step forward, and now they couldn't avoid what was happening. He had a card they hadn't anticipated. You. Trevor didn't finish the sentence because Kiann had already shown the document. It was a copy of their contract, but with additions that changed the entire landscape. He knew this contract could be the key to unraveling all their manipulations. You thought I wouldn't understand what you're planning? Kiann asked, his gaze becoming even more determined. Now that I understand your intentions, I can turn everything to my advantage. And all that's left for you is to face the consequences. Gwen and Trevor exchanged glances, but Kiann no longer gave them a chance. He understood that now he controlled the situation, and he was ready for the next step. Kiann stood before Gwen and Trevor, feeling his heart slowly breaking with anger and betrayal. He held the document in his hands, one that could turn the game upside down, but he still hadn't secured the final victory. Now he had to face the question, could he expose them, or were they still in control? Trevor nervously glanced at the document in Kiann's hands, while Gwen remained neutral. She no longer looked as confident as before. Kiann realized that it could still be turned to his advantage, but the more he thought about it, the more he felt that the situation wasn't as simple as it seemed. You think this will all end so easily? When asked, her voice no longer as cold. She was watching him, and there was a hint of concern in her eyes. It will end as it should, Kiann replied, trying to keep calm. If you thought you could manipulate me, you were gravely mistaken. Trevor stepped closer and ripped the document from Kiann's hands. Don't think you still have any trump cards, he said, but there was uncertainty in his voice. You only have what we allowed you to see. Kiann frowned and took a step back. At that moment, he realized that what they had told him wasn't the whole truth. They had manipulated him, but it turned out their plan wasn't as complete as they had initially thought. He still held a thread in his hands that could change everything. But what exactly had Kiann missed before? What was the final piece of the puzzle that changed the situation? Suddenly, Gwen stepped forward. In her hand was a small black object, resembling a flash drive. She looked at Kiann, then threw it directly onto the table in front of him. Here's your chance. This is the video. All the evidence you've been looking for is on that flash drive. Just don't forget, Kiann, all of this has long been part of our plan. Kiann stared in surprise at the flash drive, but his hands didn't tremble. He was ready for this, although he didn't understand that he still didn't know everything. He plugged the flash drive into the computer, and the screen filled with shadows, distorted bodies, and voices. These were video clips from surveillance cameras, recordings of phone calls, and meetings that he had never seen before. But one video was missing. Kiann couldn't find what he expected. There was no one there who should have been his enemy, no final proof. It was all fragments that didn't fit together into one complete picture. You deceived me, he said, looking at Gwen with a new sense of betrayal. No, you just don't see what's behind these fragments, she replied, her face remaining unfazed. You're only starting to understand that none of this was meant to break you, Kiann. It's meant to show you that you're just a small part of a bigger game, and what you just did only raises the stakes. And at that moment, Kiann realized he was on the brink of disaster. All his struggle, everything he had gone through, was merely a part of a much larger game, one that went deeper than he could have ever imagined. And it seemed he had become its victim, even though he still didn't fully understand who these people really were. He turned off the computer, placed the flash drive on the table, and looked at Gwen and Trevor. I thought I would be the one to end this story, but I see now that you want me to be part of your game, he said, his voice cold and resolute. But you're wrong. I haven't made up my mind yet. Gwen and Trevor responded in unison. You still don't understand what really happened. Well, let's see who wins in the end, Kiann said, approaching the door. His heart was beating faster than ever, but he couldn't stop. He knew this moment, this final move, would be the most crucial. The moment Kiann left the room, he felt his entire reality shift. Even more questions remained unanswered, and he didn't have the time to find the right answers. Yet one thing was certain. He was now part of something much bigger than he could have imagined. And now, a question for you men. Are you ready to be part of a game where not all the cards are on your side, or will you choose to fight till the end, even when everything seems lost?